A mad horse chained for 10 years behind a forgotten mansion. A poor girl who walked through fear to believe in his trembling eyes. And then, as the house burned, the creature the world once called a monster charged into the flames to drag her out of death's grip. Are you ready? Subscribe now to follow our most haunting and inspiring cinematic stories. You won't want to miss a single one. The sky above Seguin, Texas, boiled in a hard, merciless blue, like glass stretched to its limit. Cicadas screamed from the cracked bark of pecan trees. Heat shimmered off rusted rooftops. Every door in town, wooden, metal, or glass, seemed locked tighter than the last. Windows had curtains pulled. Dogs barked behind fences too high for any child to see over. A town of silence and suspicion sweating in its own stillness. A camera would glide slowly through Main Street. Dusty sidewalks, cracked like tired hands, peeling paint on the grocery store sign, a laundromat where dryers hummed behind glass, indifferent to the heat. Metal fences surrounded nearly every property. Not decorative ones, but tall, unwelcoming, the kind used to keep things in or keep things out. People moved, but only just. A woman smoked on her porch, eyes narrowed. A man washed his pickup truck with tight mechanical strokes. No one spoke unless they had to. This was Seguin, not just small, but guarded. Not just forgotten, but forgetful. And walking alone down that sun-cracked street was a girl, 10 years old, bare feet inside old sneakers with holes at the toes. Emilia wore a hand-me-down dress, 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist, with a rope someone once used for hauling crates. Her brown hair stuck to her cheeks with sweat, but she didn't wipe it away. She walked with the practiced silence of a child who's learned to be invisible. She didn't hum, didn't skip, just walked, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes focused ahead. But when she reached the broken fence line near the edge of town, the one no one looked at anymore, she stopped. Beyond the fence, an abandoned mansion sat rotting beneath the Texas sun. Its once white facade was now smeared with brown and gray, like dried tears. Shutters hung crooked like broken wings. Ivy strangled the walls in patches, as though the earth was slowly trying to pull it down. A stone fountain at the center of the yard was dry, its cherub cracked at the mouth. A swing set rusted, leaning swayed faintly, though no wind blew. But Emilia wasn't looking at any of that. She was looking at the backyard. Behind the house, beyond a second iron gate half-eaten by rust, lay a stretch of overgrown grass, wild thistles tall enough to cut your knees. And in the center of that field, there was movement. A figure. At first it looked like a statue, still massive. But then it shifted. A horse, red, big, and chained. Thick iron links wrapped around its neck, looped through a ground stake driven deep into the earth. The horse's coat, once maybe a fiery chestnut, was dulled by dust and sweat, but still shimmered darkly in the places the sun touched. Its mane was matted, tangled like roots. The animal didn't pace. It didn't rear. It stood stock still like a soldier at the edge of madness. Then it twitched. The clank of the chain echoed across the yard like a gunshot. The horse flinched and spun, white-rimmed eyes searching. Its muscles rippled like a living sculpture. Ears back, breath sharp. Its hooves dug at the dirt, not to charge, but to stay upright. Not wildness, but panic in slow motion. Controlled hysteria. Emilia didn't move. She barely breathed. Her small fingers wrapped around the chain-link fence. The metal burned her skin, but she didn't care. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from something stranger, more electric recognition. The way the horse stood, the way it breathed. This wasn't fury. It was pain. The horse looked toward her. Their eyes met. It didn't last long, half a second, maybe less, but it cracked something open. There was no sound. No neigh. No cry. Just that look. Deep, unreadable. Emilia's breath hitched. In those eyes, she didn't see rage. She saw the kind of silence that comes after too many screams. The exhaustion of something punished again and again for simply existing. She stepped closer to the fence. The chain links creaked. The horse flinched. Emilia froze, hands up. She didn't speak, didn't try to soothe. She just stood there, barefoot, small, unarmed by anything but stillness. The wind shifted. A dry gust tossed her hair across her face. She pushed it away and leaned forward, face against the fence. She didn't blink. The horse snorted once, then turned its head not away, but slightly to the side. Not dismissal, not submission, but curiosity. It was enough. She didn't know how long she stood there. The shadows began to stretch across the yard, the thistles casting long fingers over cracked concrete. In the distance, a dog barked twice. Then silence again. She turned and walked home. But something stayed behind an invisible tether stretched between her chest and that patch of dry grass held not by rope or iron, but something quieter. Something neither of them had words for. Later that evening, Emilia sat cross-legged on the trailer porch, scraping mud from her shoes with a spoon she wasn't supposed to take outside. Her mother was inside yelling on the phone, her voice tight with apology. Emilia tuned it out. The spoon scraped. Her gaze drifted toward the tree line where the last rays of sun caught the air in amber. Somewhere beyond those trees, behind iron and whispers, was the horse. She didn't know its name, didn't know its story, but she knew its eyes. They looked like hers. Across town, in a bar, too dark for the early hour, two men sat nursing warm beer. "Damn thing's still back there," one grunted. "Should have shot it years ago. Didn't old man Keller say it damn near killed his cousin? Trampled him, busted 3 ribs. Heard it bit a kid, too. Probably rabid." Silence. A swig. A sigh. "Funny, though. Ain't no one ever see it move unless someone's near it." "That ain't funny. That's dangerous." "Same thing." They both nodded as if danger and mystery were the same currency in a town like this. Something you locked behind fences, or stories, or silence. Back in her small bedroom, Emilia lay on her side, eyes open. The thin curtain fluttered, letting in a sliver of moonlight. On her nightstand, beside an empty plastic cup, sat a pencil drawing she'd made on brown paper, rough fast, but unmistakable. The horse, towering, red, bound. Below it, in block letters, she'd written one word. Crimson. Not because of blood, not because of anger, but because that was the color the sky turned when the sun gave up on the day, but before the darkness took over. That impossible in-between. That flicker of something ancient and still alive. Crimson, that was its name. And it would be the first name she ever gave anything that mattered. Morning came like a slap. Her mother slammed cabinets, muttering curses under her breath. A neighbor's car backfired. Someone yelled about a late payment. The town stirred again, its heart never asleep, only clenched. But Emilia dressed faster than usual. She skipped breakfast, snuck a carrot from the fridge, a rag from the laundry pile, and slipped out before anyone could say, "Where are you going?" She didn't know exactly what she planned to do. But something in her felt pulled, magnetized. Not by danger, not by thrill, but by a gravity deeper than either. She made her way back to the mansion. This time she didn't stop at the outer fence. She climbed it, hands scraped, dress tore. She landed hard, but didn't cry out. She stood and crept through the weeds' burrs clinging to her socks. Sweat dripped down her back. Her heart thudded. And then she saw him. Crimson. He stood in the same place as yesterday, but his head turned before she made a sound. His body tensed. The chain around his neck groaned. Emilia stopped 10 feet away. She crouched slowly, deliberately, pulled the carrot from her pocket, set it gently on the ground. No sudden moves, no words, just offerings. The horse didn't move, neither did she. A minute passed, maybe more. Then hooves shifted. Dirt kicked. The chain rattled. Crimson stepped forward once, then again, head low, eyes locked on hers. He sniffed the carrot, flicked it with his nose, then ate it. Emilia didn't smile. Not yet. She just breathed. And for the first time, in as long as either of them could remember, they weren't alone. The gossip started small like a leak under a sink. Quiet, steady, unnoticed, until suddenly everything stank. Emilia heard it first at the corner store. She had gone there to buy a bag of rice with a crumpled dollar and 4 coins she'd counted 5 times in her hand. The clerk, a woman with thinning hair and lips too thin to smile, was talking to another customer in a voice pitched just low enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be heard. "Still chained, I heard. Poor Keller boy couldn't walk for 2 months. Lord, I thought they put that thing down years ago. They tried, but no one would go near it. Must be possessed. You see its eyes." They looked over and caught Emilia listening. The clerk's gaze hardened. "You need help with something, huh?" Emilia didn't answer. She dropped the coins on the counter and left the rice behind. She walked out empty-handed, stomach tight, the words sticking to her skin like sweat. She wandered for hours that day, through alleyways and behind sheds, past the railroad tracks where trains never slowed down. Her mind kept circling the same thing. Possessed. Dangerous. Tried to put it down. No one ever said what really happened. Only that it hurt someone. They never said why or how. Just that it did. By the time Emilia got home, the sun had slanted low, casting long orange bars across the floor. Her mother was on her knees, scrubbing under the sink arm soaked to the elbow. The smell of bleach stung Emilia's nose. She stood in the doorway until her mother noticed her. "Where were you?" her mother asked, not unkindly. "Just tired." Her apron was stained, her hands cracked. "I had to tell the Martinez woman you were sick." Emilia didn't answer. She sat down at the table and watched the bleach water swirl in the bucket. After a while, she asked, "Why do people say the horse is crazy?" Her mother's hand paused mid-scrub. She leaned back, wiping her forehead with the crook of her arm. "They say it hurt someone," she replied carefully. "But why is it still alive?" Her mother sighed. "Because no one wants to deal with it. It's chained up. That's enough for most folks. Why don't they let it go?" Her mother didn't meet her eyes. "Because people are scared, Emilia." She said it like a closing door, not angry, not cruel, just final. Emilia didn't ask anything else. But something in her stomach twisted, slow and sour. Later that night, as her mother slept on the couch with the TV flickering on mute, Emilia slipped out the door. She took nothing with her. Not a flashlight, not a snack, not even shoes. She didn't need anything. The moon was high and heavy, a white coin dropped by God and left to rot. She walked through dew-slick grass, her feet going numb from the cold. When she reached the edge of the mansion yard, she didn't climb the fence this time. She just crouched behind it, her fingers curled through the wire. Crimson stood in the yard, awake, watching her. The chain gleamed in the moonlight like a noose. He didn't come closer, didn't move. Neither did she. The next morning, she walked the long way to school down 4th Street, where no kids played, and old Mr. Tally kept 15 bird cages but never fed the birds. As she passed by the boarded-up church with the caved-in steeple, she saw him, an old man sitting on a folding chair outside a double-wide trailer. He had one arm. The left sleeve of his shirt was neatly pinned where it ended at the shoulder. He wore a straw hat and sipped tea from a chipped mug. His dark skin shimmered under the sun like polished mahogany. Next to him, a radio played Billie Holiday, scratchy and soft. He looked up as she passed. "You walk like your shoes owe you money," he said. She paused, looked down at her shoes, smiled just a little. He sipped again. "You're the girl who stares at the Keller house." She tensed. "So?" He shrugged. Didn't say it was bad, just said it's true. She took a few steps toward him. "Do you know what happened to that horse?" "I know what they say happened," he said. "But stories in this town are like meat left in the sun. They rot quick, and the smell lingers longer than truth." She didn't know what that meant exactly, but she liked how it sounded. "You think he's dangerous?" she asked. "Who?" "The horse." The old man leaned forward. His eyes were sharp, and they made her stomach flutter the way it did when Crimson looked at her. "Tell me, child," he said. "Did you see him scream? Or did you just see him chained?" She opened her mouth, closed it. She hadn't seen him scream. She hadn't seen him do anything wrong. "I saw fear," she said finally, "like a cornered thing." The old man nodded. "Fear's a funny thing. It don't look the same in everyone. But it feels the same. Deep, cold, and loud." He looked down at his missing arm. "They said I was crazy once too." "Why?" "Because I tried to stop a man from beating a stray dog with a pipe. Dog bit him. I pulled the dog off, got bit myself. They said I trained it to attack folks. Said I was one of those animal people, like I chose dogs over people. They stopped letting me come to church. Stopped saying hello." He ran a finger along the rim of his mug. "The dog ran off. I never saw it again. But they remember me. Still call me One-Armed Jeb like it's all I ever been." Emilia felt her chest tighten. "That's not fair." "Nothing fair about fear, little one," he said. "Fear makes folks mean. Mean makes them blind." She looked at the trailer's porch. There was a rusted dog bowl near the steps. A cracked leash. A photograph tucked behind the doorframe of a mutt with one floppy ear and mismatched eyes. "You think the horse remembers?" she asked. "Every animal remembers," he said. "But only the good ones forgive." She sat beside him then. Not on the steps, not too close, but close enough. "What's his name?" The old man tilted his head. "The horse?" She nodded. "Don't think anyone ever gave him one? They just called him Keller's Curse." "That's not a name." "No, it ain't." She looked down at her scratched hands, her dusty shoes. "I called him Crimson." The old man's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good name," he said. "Sharp, heavy, sticks in your throat when you say it." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "You thinking of going back?" She nodded. "Be careful." Not because of him, but because people hurt what they don't understand. And sometimes they hurt what you love, just to make sure you're not different. "I'm already different," she said. "Then love harder," he replied. That night, Emilia lay in bed with the window open. Crickets sang. The air smelled like rain, though the sky was dry. She thought about the horse, the chain, the stories. She thought about Jeb, the dog, the silence he'd lived in for decades. And she made a promise not aloud, but deep inside her chest, where the truth lives. She would not let Crimson disappear. Not the way Jeb's dog had. Not the way stories swallowed truth. She would see him, And more than that, she would make the world see him too, even if it took everything, even if it hurt. Because some creatures were only dangerous when they had no one left to trust. And some girls were only brave because no one ever gave them permission to be anything else. The next time Emilia returned to the mansion, she brought two things: a bruised apple and a dirty towel she stole from under the sink. She held both against her chest as she ducked through the back alley, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the pecan trees, throwing long gold shadows across the weeds. It was the hour of hush, the time before dinner, when the world seemed to take one long, collective breath. Emilia crept along the back of the rusted fence, fingers brushing against the cold chain links, and found the loose board she had wedged open 2 days ago with a rock. Her hands trembled as she pushed through. On the other side, the grass was wild and full of thorns grabbing at her knees like they were trying to hold her back. Crimson stood where he always stood, at the far end of the yard, tethered by the thick chain around his neck, half in shadow. The iron links gleamed red in the dying light, making the wounds around his neck look fresh. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't grazing. He was just waiting. She could feel his eyes before she saw them. Emilia dropped to her knees. Slowly, she unwrapped the towel and placed the apple on top of it like an offering. She didn't move closer. Not yet. Her movements were deliberate, careful, like a prayer being said without sound. The apple glistened, its skin split along one side where it had hit the kitchen floor earlier that morning. Crimson didn't flinch, but his ears twitched. Emilia scooted back 3 feet and stayed there, kneeling in the thistles. A mosquito landed on her forearm, and she let it. Her breath came slow and shallow. Her eyes never left his. After a long minute, the horse shifted. Just one hoof. The chain clinked. Emilia's hands tightened into fists on her thighs. Crimson stepped forward, then back, then forward again. He sniffed the air like the scent of the apple might betray a trap. He lowered his head slowly, nostrils flaring, and for the first time, Emilia saw his tongue, a flash of pink, in the shadow of his breath, lap across the bruised side of the fruit. Then almost reluctantly, he took it in his mouth. The crunch echoed across the yard like something breaking. Not just the apple. Something older. Emilia didn't move, didn't smile, didn't dare exhale. The horse stood chewing a piece of apple skin stuck to the side of his muzzle. She watched his jaw work slowly, the muscles in his throat twitching. When he finished, he snorted once loud and turned his head to look at her directly. Not wildly, just plainly, like a question. And in that moment, the chain didn't look like control anymore. It looked like shame. The next day, Emilia came again, and the day after that. She brought a pear once, half a sandwich, a handful of oats in a torn paper cup. She sat farther and farther forward, each time inching closer, each time staying longer. Crimson began to recognize her scent, her gait, the shape of her silence. It became their language. On the 4th day, she brought the towel again, not with food this time, but wet with water from the sink. She had spent the morning boiling it on the stove, then cooling it in the breeze, the way her mother did for fevers. Her knees were scratched from all the fence climbing. Her dress had a new rip near the shoulder. But she didn't care. She carried the towel like it was sacred. When she entered the yard, Crimson turned toward her with a soft clank of chain. There was no sound between them, except the wind rattling the dead leaves. Emilia walked toward him, keeping low, not in fear but in reverence. She held the towel out in one hand, her other palm flat by her side. Crimson shifted his weight, ears back. The tension in his legs spoke louder than a scream. She stopped 5 feet away. She crouched. She placed the towel on the ground and rolled it gently toward him with one hand. He sniffed, took 1 step back, then forward again. The chain groaned. Emilia reached into her pocket and pulled out another apple, smaller this time, green and tart. She bit into it first, showed him her teeth, then laid the rest down. Crimson hesitated, then approached. He ate the apple in 2 bites. His breath was loud in her ears. She reached for the towel, very slowly. She didn't try to wipe his face, not yet. That would be too much. Instead, she dipped the towel in the small bowl of water she'd brought and wrung it out. Then ever so carefully, she touched it to his front leg, where mud and flies had gathered in a crust near the hoof. The moment she touched him, he jerked. The chain tightened. His head shot back. Emilia fell to her knees, the towel slipping from her hand. He hadn't kicked. He hadn't bucked. He'd just panicked, and in the panic bled. The chain had sliced deeper into the soft skin behind his jaw. Fresh blood glistened there now, redder than rust. Emilia crawled backward, her palms stinging. She stopped when she hit a tree root and sat there, arms limp, watching him breathe. He was shaking. So was she. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She bowed her head, not in fear, but in apology. She set the towel beside her and pushed the apple core toward him with her foot. Then she stood up and walked away. It took 3 more days before he let her touch him again. 3 days of bringing water and fruit and sitting in the sun-soaked grass without speaking, without reaching, just being. On the third evening, clouds rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked in the distance. Crimson stood ears high, watching the sky twitch. Emilia sat on the ground, towel in her lap. She didn't offer food this time, just presence. Crimson approached her. Slowly, he lowered his head. She extended her hand. It hovered in the air between them like a thread about to snap. Then, contact. Her fingers brushed the side of his jaw. His skin was warm and trembling. She laid her palm flat against his neck. He didn't move. Her hand was shaking. But Crimson stood still. A breeze blew through the yard, lifting dust from the ground, curling it in little whirlwinds. The sky overhead rumbled again, low and tired. The moment held its breath. Then softly she whispered, "Crimson." He didn't flinch. She said it again, this time with weight, like she was naming something that had always existed, but had never been claimed. "Crimson." The name settled between them, like a secret finally spoken. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, closed her eyes. Crimson exhaled through his nose, warm against her scalp. In the distance, a dog barked once, then silence. The chain still held, but something had been broken, and something else had been made. Neither of them could name it, but they could feel it. And in that yard, soaked in the memory of thunder, beneath a sky about to cry a girl and a horse, two beings long forgotten, long feared, stood together, bound by silence, and healed by it. It started with a peach pit, half buried in the dirt, sticky with rot, glistening under the morning sun, behind the Keller estate's chain-link fence. Mrs. Delaney saw it while walking her terrier. The dog stopped to sniff the grass, tugging toward the fence, and there it was, a trail of small, careless crumbs left by someone who had no reason to be there. Someone who didn't belong. She narrowed her eyes. The chain was still in place. She could see that from the street. The beast was lying in the far corner, half shaded by a collapsed section of the roof overhang. But the peach pit wasn't there before, and neither were the broken carrot tops she spotted 3 feet away. The town had rules, even for its ghosts, especially for its ghosts. By noon, she'd already told Officer Lang. By sundown, the mayor's nephew had posted a warning on the community bulletin board: "Keep out. Property under watch. No trespassing. Dangerous animal report. Any unauthorized activity to authorities." The notice flapped in the wind like a flag of suspicion. That night, Emilia came home late. Too late. Her mother was standing at the sink, hands buried in soap and dishwater, back rigid. A small radio played Tejano music just loud enough to cover the silence. Emilia tried to tiptoe past. Her shoes, caked with dried mud, left dark streaks across the linoleum. She didn't notice, but her mother did. "What's that on your shoes?" The voice was calm, too calm. Emilia froze. "Answer me." She turned slowly. "Just mud." "From where?" "I was walking." "Where?" "Nowhere." A pause. The music chirped on, oblivious. Then came the sound of the faucet turning off. Water draining. A slow, deliberate wiping of hands on a rag. Then footsteps. Her mother stood in front of her now. Not tall, but tired. That deep kind of exhaustion that coils itself around a person's spine and makes every word feel like a weight. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not." "You've been near that house, near that thing." Emilia's eyes flickered. Her mother didn't wait. The slap cracked louder than thunder. Emilia's cheeks stung with heat. But what burned more was the silence that followed. "You want to get me fired," her mother hissed. "You want them saying I can't even keep my girl from breaking into cursed places? I didn't." "You think they'll let me scrub floors if they think I raised a thief, a trespasser? I'm not stealing." Her mother turned away, voice rising. "You don't get it? You never have. People like us don't get to make mistakes. We don't get to explain. We get judged and left behind." Emilia's hands balled into fists. "He's not dangerous." "Oh, so now it's a he." Silence again. "Then you're just like your father." The words dropped like stones into a well. Her mother covered her mouth the moment they left. But it was too late. Emilia stepped back. 1, 2, then turned and ran out the door. She didn't stop until the mansion swallowed her. The sky was black. No stars. Just the hum of power lines and the far-off screech of tires on county roads. She didn't use the loose fence plank this time. She climbed the rusted gate hands, slipping knees scraped. Her shoes landed hard in the thistle as she dropped down. Crimson lifted his head. He had been lying still, chain slack beside him. But now, seeing her, he rose slowly, carefully. She didn't bring food or water or a towel. Just herself and tears. "I hate them," she said, voice rough with dirt and salt. Crimson took a step forward, ears twitching. "I hate this town. I hate the way they look at me, like I'm always doing something wrong." The horse moved closer. The chain dragged. "They think you're a monster. They think I'm going to become one." She crouched down, burying her face in her arms. "I didn't even do anything." Crimson stood a foot away now, breathing, watching. "You're the only thing that doesn't hit me," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "You're the only one that doesn't flinch when I talk." A sob broke loose from her throat, sudden and guttural. Her whole body shook, and that's when it happened. Not loudly, but softly. A touch. The warmth of a muzzle nudged her shoulder gently. Then again, she looked up, eyes red. Crimson didn't blink. She reached for him, fingers trembling, and rested her hand against his neck. He didn't move away. The moon slid from behind a cloud, then casting silver light over the chain around his throat. And Emilia saw it. Rust. Hairline fractures near the base link. A weakness. The iron was starting to give. And she knew without being told that it wasn't from force. It wasn't from time. It was from trust. Bit by bit, day by day, the thing that had kept him prisoner was surrendering to something far more dangerous and far more real. Faith. They stood together like that for a long time. Girl and beast. Neither whole, neither broken. The wind whispered through the weeds, carrying the sounds of distant sirens. Someone somewhere had done something unforgivable, but not here. Not now. Here in the ruins of something forgotten, two hearts beat in time, and the chain around one of them began to fail. The first flash of lightning cracked the sky open like a rib cage. It forked violently over the hills outside Seguin, illuminating the Keller mansion for one white-hot instant. Ivy clawing up the stone walls, shingles curled back like peeling skin windows, yawning hollow. Then darkness again. Thick, wet waiting. Rain hadn't come yet. Only the threat of it. The air was charged with that chemical scent of ozone and dry rot. Street lamps flickered. Dogs whined in their yards. Birds fled low against the wind. Inside her bedroom, Emilia was already halfway out the window. She'd seen the storm forming, felt it in her chest like a bruise coming back to life. And she'd heard it, that shuddering crack of thunder, just as she'd spotted the first flicker of light on the horizon, glowing too close, too wrong, behind the Keller house. The mansion. Something was happening. She didn't think. She grabbed the flashlight, the small fruit knife from the kitchen, and the damp towel still drying on her bedpost. Then, she was gone, feet slapping pavement, hair flying wild in the rising wind. Her lungs burned by the time she reached the overgrown lot, but she didn't slow down. The sky screamed again. A second bolt arced downward and hit somewhere close, so close the ground beneath her vibrated. Then it came a sharp mechanical pop from the mansion, followed by a hum, then fire. It started in the corner of the old attic where the rain gutter had collapsed years ago. Lightning had struck the rusted wire from the broken fuse box and open nerve. The spark ignited a bird's nest wedged between the rafters. Dry straw, dried droppings, old wood. It caught instantly. The flames spread fast, running across the dry beams, like water poured across hunger. Within seconds, the entire attic glowed orange. Smoke slithered down through the stairwells, thick and oily. Glass cracked. Walls groaned. Crimson screamed, not the high, frantic whinny of panic, but something deeper, older. A roar pulled from the bottom of the lungs, a warning and a cry at once. Emilia scrambled over the fence, heart hammering so loud it drowned the storm. She bolted across the field, the smell of smoke already reaching her, sweet and sharp like burning syrup. Crimson was thrashing his hooves, tearing trenches into the ground chain, yanking at his neck with a sound that made her sick. She didn't see the first sparks hit the dry brush near the porch, didn't hear the roof collapsing in the back. She only saw him. He was pulling so hard against the chain that blood leaked in thin ribbons down his shoulder. The metal links had already worn deep gouges where skin should have been smooth. "Crimson," she shouted. He snapped his head toward her, eyes white and wild. The fire hadn't reached the yard yet, but it was coming. Smoke rolled out like tongues of shadow reaching for the ground. The heat had changed the air. It shimmered, warped. Breathing became work. She reached for the chain first. It was too hot. She jerked her hand back, skin stinging. Then she yanked the towel from her shoulder, wrapped it around the base of the chain, and pulled with everything she had. It didn't budge. Behind her, flames leapt through a broken window. Sparks rained across the overgrown grass. The night had turned orange. Crimson shrieked again, and this time he reared hooves, flashing. The chain snapped taut, and Emilia fell back. The metal groaned. Crimson twisted muscles, bulging teeth bared. He threw his weight against the restraint once, twice. Clang! A link cracked. Not broken, but failing. Emilia jumped to her feet. The fire was at the porch now, licking up the side columns like a hungry mouth. Embers drifted past her like tiny red ghosts. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, break it, please." Crimson turned in a tight circle, neck straining. He planted his front hooves and lunged. Snap! The chain didn't break, but it tore free from the ground. The stake, long rusted into the soil, had finally given way. Crimson stumbled, then caught himself. The chain still dangled from his neck, trailing behind him like a wounded limb, but he was free. And Emilia was coughing now, choking on the smoke. "Run," she wheezed. "Come on, we have to—" A sudden explosion from inside the house sent a shockwave through the air. The pressure knocked her sideways. A support beam collapsed near the back door. The firestorm had turned. The wind changed. In seconds, the field was swallowed in light and heat. A wall of flame roared up beside them, cutting off the path to the fence. Smoke closed in. Emilia stumbled, legs giving out hand over her mouth. She collapsed in the thistle. Crimson turned. He saw her. He could have run. He could have vanished into the night. But he didn't. With a sound that was almost a growl, Crimson charged through the burning air, hooves pounding so hard the earth shook. He reached her, lowered his head, bit into the back of her dress, and yanked. She didn't move. He dragged harder, tugging her limp form across the ground with his teeth clenched in the fabric. His legs buckled once. The chain wrapped around his front leg. He stumbled, almost fell into the fire. He kept going. Every movement left blood on the grass from his neck, his mouth, his hooves. But he kept going. And when they reached the edge of the fence, he reared up and slammed his front hooves into the gate until it bent, shrieked, and gave way just enough. He pulled her through, out of the yard, into the open night. Then he collapsed beside her. A neighbor saw them. He had come to film the fire to post it on Facebook. But what his camera captured instead was a girl and a horse. One unmoving, one bleeding on the other side of a broken gate framed by a mansion swallowed in flame. The man dropped his phone and whispered, "What the hell?" Sirens wailed 5 minutes later, but by then Crimson was gone. Just a blood trail leading into the woods, and a girl still breathing, covered in ash and love. The footage hit the local news by sunrise. A grainy clip from a shaky phone, the Keller mansion engulfed in fire smoke, rising like a cathedral in collapse, and most impossibly, a horse dragging a limp child through the smoke. Not galloping, not wild, but deliberate, muscular, bleeding. The voice of the man filming crackled beneath the flames. Holy God. It's saving her, Jesus. It's saving her. The video looped all morning on phones, on TVs, in waiting rooms, and barbershops. It traveled faster than gossip, faster than disbelief. Within hours, the town of Seguin had something it hadn't had in years. A miracle, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, Crimson was already gone. The search began before the mansion had even stopped smoldering. Sheriff Lang brought in a tracking dog. They found patches of blood near the woods, a few clumps of red hair, and drag marks where hooves had torn through the mud. But the trail stopped cold at the creek bed just east of the abandoned rail line. Too smart, someone muttered, or too wild. By noon, the speculation had begun. He didn't save her, said Mr. Phelps, sipping coffee at the corner diner. Just ran, got spooked. Probably dragged her by accident. Dragged her 30 yards away from the fire, snapped Miss Flannery from the school board. Animals panic. Instinct kicks in. That wasn't instinct. That was choice. You ever seen a horse choose to walk through fire for someone? The silence that followed was long and uneven. Still, Phelps grumbled, ain't like he stayed. If it really cared about her, why'd it run? Because you made it run, Emilia would have said, if she'd been awake. But she wasn't. Emilia lay in a white hospital bed, vui in her arm. Dried blood still beneath her fingernails. Her hair smelled like smoke and dirt and something older. The doctors said she'd passed out from smoke inhalation. Minor burns on her right side. Bruises on her ribs from being dragged. But no broken bones. No head trauma. Lucky, they said. Miraculous. But she didn't speak. Not once. Not when the nurse asked her name. Not when her mother arrived, hands shaking, eyes red. Not even when the sheriff crouched beside her bed and said, "You're a brave little girl." She stared straight ahead. Not angry, not scared. Just gone. In her arms, clutched tight against her chest, was the rusted length of chain from Crimson's collar. The broken link still twisted at the end like a question no one could answer. No one tried to take it from her. Not even the nurses. It was the only thing she seemed to feel. Outside the hospital, the crowd swelled. Reporters came from San Antonio, one from Austin. They gathered at the fence line of the burnt-down mansion, taking photos of the scorched gate, the blackened trees, the patch of flattened grass where someone had found her shoe. Children stared at the spot where Crimson had last stood. Old men leaned against their trucks and whispered in tones that were part awe, part discomfort. The story had taken root, but not everyone agreed on what it was. Some called it a tragedy, others a sign. Some said it was God's doing, others called it madness. It was just an animal barked a deacon after Sunday service. An animal don't make moral choices. But what if it did, someone asked. That's blasphemy, he muttered, crossing himself. At the trailer, Emilia's mother smoked 3 cigarettes in silence. She didn't go back to work that week. Couldn't face the questions. Couldn't face herself. She sat at the edge of Emilia's empty bed and ran her fingers along the scorched corner of the dress her daughter had worn the night of the fire. The fabric crumbled beneath her touch. She pressed it to her face and wept, not for the burns, not even for the fear, but for how little she had seen. She remembered the words she'd thrown, "You're just like your father," and she felt them now, like bricks inside her chest. By the end of the week, Crimson had become more ghost than horse. No one had seen him. No new tracks. No trail of blood. Nothing. But his presence remained etched into the scorched earth, woven into the town's breath, like smoke that wouldn't clear. Children began to draw him on napkins and chalk on the sidewalk, in notebook margins at school. Always with fire. Always with a girl beside him. Sometimes with wings. A local artist painted a mural on the side of the library. It was just a silhouette, a massive red horse in profile, head-bowed chain dangling from its neck, broken link at the end. Behind it, fire. Beneath it, the words, "What we fear most might just be what saves us." Some townspeople demanded it be painted over, but most just stared at it and said nothing. On the 9th day, Emilia blinked. It was the first thing she'd done differently since the fire. Nurse Jolene noticed it, told her mother. On the 10th day, Emilia whispered something, just 2 words. Her mother leaned in, pressing her ear close. "Find him." It was the only thing she said all week, but it was enough. Sheriff Lang ordered another sweep of the woods. Volunteers joined. Some brought carrots, some brought salt licks. Others brought nothing but their own quiet shame. No one found him, but they kept looking. Not because they thought they'd succeed, but because something had shifted. Crimson had become more than legend. He'd become mirror. Some saw guilt in it, others grace, but everyone saw themselves. And Emilia, she stayed in her hospital bed, arms wrapped around the chain eyes, watching the window, waiting for the sound of hooves, or maybe just the feeling that somewhere out there, he was still watching her back, the way no one else ever had. The world kept moving, but Emilia didn't. She drifted through her days like fog there, but not touching anything. Not words, not people, not even time. The teachers gave her makeup tests. She didn't answer. Classmates whispered around her like she was made of glass. At recess, she sat under the same dying tree every day, staring at her own shoes like they belonged to someone else. At home, she didn't eat unless her mother put the food directly in front of her, didn't speak unless asked a yes or no question, and even then most of her answers were silence. The rusted chain from Crimson's neck stayed hidden in a pillowcase beneath her bed. She'd touch it when the nights got too quiet, let her fingers trace the broken link like it might click open a memory she could survive. She never cried. That was the part that scared her mother the most. One Thursday afternoon, Emilia came home with a notice from school. "Emilia has not spoken in class for 26 days, it read. "We are deeply concerned. Consider counseling options." Her mother folded the note slowly. She didn't cry either. She just sat at the table chain-smoking, staring at the stained linoleum floor, like it had betrayed her somehow. Then she picked up the phone. "Dr. Lorraine Cortez," she said, her voice tight. "You still take walk-ins?" A pause. "I know you're not that kind of doctor. But someone told me you work with hard cases." A longer pause. "Yes, my daughter." Lorraine Cortez lived on the outskirts of Seguin, where the fence lines grew wild and the soil turned red in summer. Her clinic was built out of an old gas station converted with repurposed barnwood and mismatched windows. The sign read, "Second Chance Animal Rescue," and sometimes people. The waiting room smelled like cedar and antiseptic. The hum of fans cut through the heat. A black cat with one eye lay sprawled across the check-in desk, flicking its tail at invisible ghosts. Emilia sat on a cracked leather bench, staring at her reflection in the floor tiles. Her mother filled out paperwork in silence. Lorraine emerged from the back clipboard in hand hair streaked with silver braid, thick and tight like a rope. She was in her 60s, maybe more, with shoulders like she'd lifted every creature that ever limped through her door. Her eyes were dark, sharp, but not unkind. "You're the girl from the fire?" she said matter-of-fact. Emilia didn't look up. Lorraine crouched in front of her, balanced on the balls of her feet. Her voice dropped. "You don't have to talk. You don't even have to listen. But I need a helper today. Think you can do that?" Emilia stared at her shoes. Lorraine stood. "Good, I thought so." They walked to the back of the clinic together, Lorraine leading Emilia trailing 3 steps behind. They passed Kennel's supply shelves, a surgical light that flickered when the AC kicked in. The building smelled of old fur and something clean like chamomile. Lorraine stopped at a closed door. Behind this, she said, "is someone I trust more than most people I know." She opened the door. Inside was a mutt, large, patchy graying around the snout. One of its back legs was missing, amputated clean above the knee. The scar had healed badly, but the dog moved like it had learned to trust the imbalance. It stood the moment they entered. No barking, just a tail thump. Lorraine leaned against the wall. "That's Bones. Found him outside Luling, tied to a tree. Someone took a machete to his leg." Emilia's eyes flinched toward her, then back to the dog. "I tried to put him down at first. Thought it'd be kinder." She smiled. "He wouldn't let me." Bones limped over to Emilia, sniffed her hand, then sat beside her feet and looked up. Not waiting for command, not asking for food. Just waiting. Emilia didn't touch him at first, but she didn't move away either. Minutes passed. Then slowly, her hand lowered. Not in a stroke, but a simple placement. Fingers on fur. Stillness on stillness, and Bones exhaled. The sound knocked something loose inside her chest. Not a sob. Not yet, but a shift. She crouched down, forehead pressing gently to his. Closed her eyes. When she opened them, Lorraine was watching. "Why isn't he scared of me?" Emilia whispered. It was the first thing she'd said in months. Lorraine didn't react. She just stepped closer and said softly, "He lost everything. But he still believes in kindness." Emilia's eyes watered not from crying, but from the weight of it. "People hit me," she whispered. "People call me liar. People left him in fire." Her voice cracked like dry wood. Bones leaned into her. "He doesn't care," Lorraine said. "He only sees that you stayed." They sat together for an hour, just girl-dog, an air full of the unsaid. As the sun dipped low through the wire-scratched windows, Lorraine placed something beside Emilia on the floor. A book. Its cover was worn corners bent. On it was a sketch of a crow perched beside a wolf. "The language between us. I wrote that," Lorraine said. "After I got out of the army. Spent most of my 20s treating dogs with PTSD. Turns out they listen better than people do." Emilia ran her fingers along the cover. She didn't open it. Not yet, but she held it. Lorraine crouched again. "Animals don't speak in words, Emilia. Not really. They speak in waiting, in patience, in not flinching." Her voice lowered. "In forgiveness." Emilia nodded once, and Bones licked her knee. That night, for the first time in nearly 40 days, Emilia stood by her bedroom window, the chain in her hand, and whispered toward the dark, "If you're still out there." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The air felt warmer somehow, like someone or something had heard. The years didn't rush Emilia. They unfolded slowly like dusk, creeping over the land, quiet and watchful. She grew like trees grow in dry soil, patient, inward, resilient. There was no sudden transformation. No music swelling to mark the moment she became someone else. Just time and choice, repeated over and over. The girl who had once whispered into firelight now walked through the world with calm in her spine and ache in her hands. And she knew what she wanted, to heal what others had tried to break. Montage. Scene 1, 18 years old. The veterinary assistant at Second Chance Rescue pulls on latex gloves. A pit bull snarls in the corner of the room, tethered to a trembling pipe. No one wants to go near it, except Emilia. She doesn't say a word. She crouches, eyes low, hands open. Her presence is a hush, not a threat. The dog growls once, stops. She inches forward, touch, gentle. A fingertip to the jawline. The growl melts. The dog licks her wrist. Cut to black. Scene 2. She's 21. College campus. Books in her lap, animal physiology, trauma psychology, equine behavior. She lives in a dorm built from brick and silence. Doesn't go to parties. Doesn't laugh loud. But professors call her unnervingly focused. Her essays are titled Trauma Responses in Confined Equines. When kindness is not a reward, but a method. A photo of a horse in her notebook, red, distant, with a chain barely visible. She keeps it folded, but touches it often. Scene 3. She's in the field now, real field, not metaphor. A dog kennel overgrown with vines. A hoarder's property confiscated by the county. Dozens of dogs locked in crates. She walks through, quiet breath, steady. No clipboard, no shouting. She unlatches a cage, one by one. A small dog snaps at her hand. She doesn't flinch. Later, the same dog sleeps on her boot. Cut to music. Soft guitar, low cello. Barely audible vocals that sound like breath turned to harmony. Scene 4. A horse with a scar across its side kicks against a stall wall. Volunteers back away. Emilia stands alone. She waits. Doesn't speak. Doesn't ask it to trust her. Eventually, the horse lowers its head, steps toward her, lets her clean the wound. Scene 5. Same woman, now 25. Her hair longer, braided back like Lorraine used to wear it. A small tattoo near her wrist, a broken chain inked in fine red line work. She's at a mobile clinic in Laredo, brushing burrs from a goat's coat. Children watch from the fence, whispering. She lets one girl hand her a brush. The girl's arm is bruised. Her gaze flickers in the same way Emilia's used to. Emilia smiles, small and knowing. "You can stay if you want," she says. The girl does. Scene 6. Midnight. Emilia sits alone at a desk lit by a cracked lamp. She writes in a leather notebook. The pages are full, not of names, but of moments. First eye contact. Held. Dog 014. No lunge. Horse with rope burns let me touch his shoulder today. No flinch. Three-legged cat slept on my stomach for first time. She closes the notebook, walks to the window. Outside the forest, black still ancient. She watches the tree line, not expecting, just remembering. Time has reshaped her voice. It's deeper now, steadier, but still soft. Her gestures say more than her sentences ever did. When she speaks to animals, she rarely uses words. A tilt of the head, a slow breath, a pause. It's all she needs. They understand her, because she never asked them to prove anything. just to be. In a barn, one late afternoon, Emilia kneels beside an emaciated mare, rescued from a dogfighting ring. The horse won't eat. A young vet tech suggests force feeding. Emilia shakes her head. She takes a handful of oats and sets it on the floor, then walks away. 2 hours later, the oats are gone. She never tells people about Crimson. Not directly. But sometimes when volunteers ask why she never carries a whip, why she lets horses approach first, why she treats dangerous dogs without muzzles, she just says, "They've already been punished." I'm not here to add more. In her small apartment above the clinic, she keeps only a few things. The notebook, a photo of bones now long past, and the broken chain. Rust has flaked away over the years, but she keeps it sealed in a glass box beside her bed. Not as a trophy. As a wound she refuses to let scab over, a scar she shares with no one but herself. She is 26 now. The fire was 16 years ago. And still some nights, she walks to the edge of the forest behind the clinic and just stands there, listening, not for hooves, not anymore, but for memory, and maybe forgiveness. On the anniversary of the fire, she hikes to the old mansion site. It's barely recognizable, swallowed by vines and time. Charred wood buried under soil walls caved in. But the iron gate still stands bent and rusted. She places a single apple in the grass, bows her head, and whispers, "Thank you." Nothing answers, but the wind shifts, and for a breath it smells like horses, like home. The gates of Red Sanctuary opened at 900 a.m. on a cloudless October morning. The breeze was cool, but the sunlight stretched warm across the red gravel drive. Balloons rustled above folding chairs. Tables covered in white cloth waited with juice cartons and cookies and name tags. Beyond them, a handmade wooden sign carved in thick serif letters stood mounted on 2 fence posts, Red Sanctuary. A refuge for the misnamed, misunderstood, and mishandled. Below it etched in a subtler hand, "We don't fix what's broken. We believe what's sacred." Emilia stood behind the podium they'd built from barnwood. 28 now. Her shoulders square, her jaw set, her braid tucked neatly down her back. She wore no makeup, no flashy jewelry, just a pair of dusty boots and the same navy button-up she always wore when calming a bucking horse. To her left, a large pen stretched open to a dry field where several animals stood quietly. A blind mule named Dusty, a 3-legged pig named Clover, a pair of sheep who flinched at the sound of trucks. Each had been deemed too dangerous, too damaged, or not worth the trouble by someone somewhere. But they were here now, and they were safe. Emilia adjusted the microphone. The small crowd, dozens of neighbors, colleagues, families quieted. Children held small paper flags that read, "You matter." A few adults crossed their arms, skeptical. But most leaned forward as if trying to catch something they weren't sure they deserved to hear. She spoke plainly. "My name is Emilia Cortez. I'm not a public speaker. I'm not good with applause or attention." Pause, a soft smile. "But I'm very good with silence, and with pain, and with animals who've been called names that don't belong to them." Another pause. The wind caught the edge of her shirt. "I've spent the last 10 years working with creatures that bite, scratch, buck, run. Not because they're evil, but because they were afraid." A murmur ran through the back row. Someone nodded. "I opened Red Sanctuary for them. The ones the shelters turned away. The ones whose files read unadoptable. The ones who made someone say, 'It's not worth it.'" Her eyes scanned the front row. Kids, lots of them. A girl with burn scars down her arms. A boy with a hearing aid and a nervous tick in his neck. A chubby boy who hadn't stopped petting the pit bull beside him since the speech began. Emilia leaned into the mic. "When I was 10, she said I was saved by a creature the town said was dangerous. Every adult in the crowd went still. I was pulled from a burning house by a horse who had been chained for years. People called him wild, rabid, cursed. But he was the first being who ever looked at me without fear." A lump built in her throat. But she let it. He didn't speak. But he trusted me. And in the moment that mattered most, he risked everything to save a child no one else had believed in. The silence in the yard deepened. Even the animals seemed to hold their breath. "I haven't seen him since," she continued. "But everything I am, everything I've built, is because of him." She stepped back, looked at the sky, then back at the crowd. "I know what it's like to be called dangerous, to be misunderstood. I know what it's like to flinch when someone raises their voice, to hold your breath in your own home." She didn't cry, but her voice cracked just once. "So I built a place where nothing flinches, where broken doesn't mean done, where silence is welcome and trust is slow, and kindness is the only language spoken." A beat. Then, "If you've ever been told you were too much, or too loud, or too scared, or too angry, there's a pen for you here, or a chair, or a patch of sun by the fence. Bye." And finally, "I believe in change. Not because it's easy, but because it happened to me. She stepped back. The microphone clicked off, and the crowd rose in applause, not loud, not raucous, but warm, long, real. The kind of sound that doesn't ask to be heard, just felt. After the speech, the kids were the first to run to the pens. They fed apples to horses with cloudy eyes. They brushed sheep that once bit strangers on instinct. They threw balls to a three-legged retriever who chased them like nothing was missing. Emilia stood near the gate, arms folded, watching, smiling. A girl approached her, maybe 9 years old, clutching a drawing colored in with shaky hands. It was a red horse covered in ash, and beside it, a girl in a blue dress holding a chain that wasn't connected to anything. "I saw your story," the girl whispered. "On the news. When I was little." Emilia knelt. The girl looked at the ground. "I used to bite people. When I got scared." Emilia smiled gently. "That means you're alive." The girl looked up. "Is the horse still alive?" Emilia said nothing for a moment, then placed her hand on the girl's heart. "If you feel this," she said, "he is." And somewhere beyond the edge of the sanctuary, past the wild trees and fields no one charted anymore, a pair of hooves pressed softly into the earth. Not fast, not loud, but steady and turning. The sun was beginning to fall when it happened. Late afternoon light stretched long across the sanctuary field. Dust motes dancing in its warmth, casting soft orange onto the red-painted barns. Laughter hung in the air. Children ran between pens clutching pamphlets and carrots. A pair of teenagers tried to coax a limping goat into a selfie. A toddler in overalls fell into a bucket and laughed so hard he made a pig snort. It was celebration, not just for animals, but for survival. And somewhere in the noise, just beyond the hum of conversation, the buzz of cameras, the warmth of shared healing, a shift occurred. It began in the silence no one noticed. At the farthest edge of the field, where the land met the tree line, a shape stood still against the dying light. It didn't move, not at first. Not until Emilia turned her head like her body had remembered something her mind had forgotten, and her breath caught in her chest. There, framed by shadow and golden dusk, stood an old horse, larger than any others on the property. Still, watchful. Its coat was dulled now, once crimson, now more rust and dusk faded from sun and years, but unmistakable. The same rippling mass of muscle and restraint. The same proud stance. The same curved neck, though lined now with gray. But what struck her wasn't the body. It was the eyes. Those eyes. Dark and wet and wide, carved from something older than fear. And there, beneath the mane, just above the collarbone, was the scar, twisting and pale, still visible after all these years. The chain mark, crimson, alive. And here, Emilia didn't speak. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her feet moved first, one step, then another. The crowd hadn't noticed yet. The children still played. Mr. Gonzalez was telling a joke near the donkey enclosure. A group of local high schoolers posed with their volunteer vests on. But a ripple started. A girl pointed, then a boy. Someone gasped. "Is that? No way. Is that him?" The name didn't come easily, but the memory did. Emilia kept walking. Slow, steady. Each step reverent. Each breath full of what she'd never allowed herself to hope. Crimson didn't move, didn't blink. Not until she was close enough that she could see the dirt crusted in the corners of his hooves. The new scars across his side, the way his chest rose and fell with fatigue. And maybe something like waiting. She raised a hand. He lowered his head. And then, forehead to forehead. No noise. Just that. Connection. A trembling line of memory pulled tight between them. Time collapsed in on itself, burning mansion chain-link fence apples in the grass. A girl who had once said, "You're the only thing that doesn't hit me." Crimson exhaled. It was a sound so low and guttural, it didn't echo, it sunk. Into the dirt. Into her spine. Into every watching soul. Behind her, someone began to cry. Mr. Jebb, now white-haired and thinner than he once was, stood with a cane clutched in one hand, a tissue in the other. He wiped his eyes once, then again. His lips trembled, but he smiled like a boy who'd waited 60 years for one thing to come right. Next to him stood Lorraine, arms folded, jaw clenched. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them, just nodded, quietly, like a soldier saluting. The crowd began to gather, cautiously at first. People who hadn't dared speak the horse's name in years now stood frozen at the edges of the path. A boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "That's the one from the fire, right?" The man looked away, didn't answer, but his jaw twitched, and he stepped forward. The horse didn't bolt, didn't flinch. He just stood beside Emilia, his flank pressed to her shoulder like a declaration. A child stepped out from the group. A girl with a scar down her face, one that ran from temple to chin, like lightning had once passed through her. Her voice soft but unshaken, carried through the yard. "I have a scar too." Every adult turned. She held up her hand, burned, puckered, trembling. "It's okay," she said to Crimson. "Scars mean you survived." Crimson blinked, then stepped closer. The girl didn't move. And the town Seguin, Texas, a town that had once chained a horse to the earth in fear, was silent. Then something shifted. A man in a cowboy hat walked forward and set a bundle of hay down beside the horse. He didn't speak, just looked once at Emilia, nodded, and turned away. Then a woman, someone who had once said he should have been shot, placed a bucket of water in the grass. Another followed, a bag of feed, then carrots, then a blanket, then hands slow, unsure, reaching out not to pet, but to apologize. In that moment, no one said the word redemption, but it hung there, as thick and real as breath, as earned as the scars on his neck. Emilia pressed her forehead to Crimson's one last time. "You're home," she whispered, not asking, just naming. "And Crimson?" He didn't speak, but his stillness answered everything. He was home, and this time, no one would chain him again. The book hit shelves on a Wednesday, not with fanfare, not with headlines, just quiet, like the turning of a page. It was called Crimson, white letters, matte texture, no subtitle. The cover showed a single image, a girl with her back to the reader, sitting beside a massive red horse under a tree. Their heads touched. Behind them, a blood-orange sky melting into a dusk that didn't promise answers but offered something softer rest. The first page carried no dedication, just a quote. "There are chains that don't hang from the neck. There are cages built with memory. But trust is the only key we never forget how to use." Emilia Cortez. It was her voice narrating the audiobook too. Soft, measured, a little rough, a little worn, but strong in the places that had once been broken. Chapter 11. The Gate That Bent. You don't always hear chains break. Sometimes you just notice they're gone. You stretch your arms one morning and realize there's more air than you remember. More room. A field you never thought you'd walk through because they told you you weren't meant to roam. I used to think the fire was the moment my life changed, but it wasn't. The real moment, it was the day I stopped asking, "Am I safe?" and started asking, "Is he?" The day I became not just the girl who was saved, but the girl who stayed. Red Sanctuary expanded. What began as a fenced patch of red dirt and secondhand wood grew into something larger, something living. People came from other towns, other counties, not just for the animals, but for what they stood for. A girl with autism found her first friend in a toothless hound. A boy who hadn't spoken in a year was caught humming next to a goat with half an ear. Foster teens from the next town over arrived every Saturday to brush mains, rebuild stalls, fix what they could. Not fix the animals, fix the quiet between them. Emilia had stopped trying to explain the mission. She just lived it. You could feel it in the gravel path under your feet. In the way every animal had a name chosen, not assigned. In the way kids were never told don't touch, but rather let them come to you. In the way the bruised didn't hide, and the scarred didn't have to explain. There was a new addition to the sanctuary sign, a small wooden plaque hung from 2 nails beneath the original engraving. It read, "Also for children with invisible leashes." On the day the foundation announced its national status, federally recognized sanctuary and trauma recovery center for humans and animals alike, they held a picnic. Simple. Folding tables, macaroni salad, lemonade with too much sugar. They served hot dogs from the grill and handed out little books filled with drawings made by the kids who lived there. Emilia sat at the edge of it all, on the grass, by the fence, watching the horizon. She didn't need the microphone, didn't need the spotlight. What she needed, what she was waiting for, was already walking toward her. From the back pasture, slow but deliberate, Crimson made his way across the field. His gait was stiffer now. The winter had left him tired. But his shoulders were still strong, his chest still full, his eyes clearer than they'd ever been, and the scar still there, still curved across his neck like a memory carved in salt, shone soft in the sun. He walked to her, stopped beside her, and stood. Emilia didn't rise. She just looked up at him, then leaned against his front leg, like she used to do with her old dog bones. He shifted slightly. She closed her eyes. The wind came up, and with it, the smell of dust and hay apples and wood. The soundtrack of survival. A child approached quietly, small, maybe 7. Hair buzzed short, deep eyes. One hand held a drawing, a horse made out of flames and hearts. The other hand reached out. Crimson turned his head, lowered it. The child placed the drawing at his feet. "He's not scary," the child whispered. "No," Emilia said. "He's kind." "Yes." The child hesitated. "Is he yours?" Emilia smiled. "No," she said. "I'm his." As sunset began to burn down the sky, Emilia stood, walked with Crimson toward the farthest oak, the one near the back fence line, where the sun always looked like blood sinking into soil. They reached the shade just as the light turned red. Emilia sat at the base of the tree. Crimson lowered beside her, folding his tired legs beneath him, like a cathedral lowering its roof. She placed a hand on his side. They both exhaled. In sync, still, unchained. The camera, if this were film, would pull back then, slow, up and out, revealing the full sanctuary, the barns, the children playing tag, the dog sleeping beside the goat, the teen girl painting over a chain-link fence with flowers. The mural of a horse and a girl side by side. The gate, open, always open. Then farther back, to the hill, to the town beyond it, to the red sky swallowing the last light. And finally, to the tree, to the old red horse, to the woman beside him, and the space between them, not silence, but peace. The final words of the book fade in as voiceover. We have all been chained by fear, by shame, by names that weren't ours. But somewhere someone still believes in the rusted, broken, beautiful version of us. And that's all it takes. Just one, to stay.